thanks, everybody. I really appreciate everybody who is here for the session today. And we're going to talk a little bit about why it's important as COVID vaccine distribution picks up, the important role that transit can play in, particularly in ensuring equity in access to the vaccine. So that's why I titled this, Getting the COVID Vaccine Shouldn't Require a Car. One of the things that struck me, especially in recent weeks, as vaccine distribution has begun to really pick up, we're seeing a lot of pictures of the vaccine being distributed at drive-up vaccine sites. Now, I want to say right off the bat, this is fantastic. We want to see people getting vaccinated. We want to get it out as fast as possible. These sites are a great example of public health officials, the private sector, in some cases, sports teams and stadiums and convention centers coming together to get vaccine distribution off the ground. But what's going to be really important going forward is to make sure that we're not over-reliant on driving as a way for people to get the vaccine. And in fact, I saw a story on CNN just last night, and it's up on screen here. The basic message of it is that we're looking at, as we're starting to see data on vaccination rates, we're unfortunately seeing that Black and brown communities are not getting vaccinated at quite the same rate as white folks. And that's the kind of disparity in the numbers that we've got to make sure as public transit, as a community, as an industry, as public servants, that there's a focus on making sure that these numbers get rebalanced. And that particularly because when you look at Black and brown communities, they're some of the most hard hit for reasons that are not specific to the virus, but are exacerbated by, economic conditions, existing health issues in those communities, decisions that have been made around, where those communities, what's located close to those communities. Pollution is a major factor. We increasingly know from scientific research that folks that live in communities that suffer from particularly respiratory ongoing issues like asthma are at greater risk of severe COVID-19. They're at greater risk of being the folks that end up in hospitals on ICUs. So it's really important that we pay attention to these communities and make sure that vaccine equity is a priority. And I've got this up on screen, this story from a website called We Like LA, a journalist out in LA by the name of Juliet Bennett-Ryla. Over the past couple of weeks, she wrote about her adventure, so to speak, her effort to get a clear answer from public health officials in LA County and the city of LA on how to get a vaccine if you don't have a car. And the story is well worth reading. I'll make sure the link is included in the PDF that's provided after the presentation. What really emerges from it is a picture of transit and walkability and bikeability and modes of transit other than cars to vaccine sites being, unfortunately, a bit of an afterthought. And that is, there's a direct connection between that not being a high priority in the thinking around these and seeing the disparity in the numbers around the vaccination rates for different communities. So the big question is, what do we do? How do we solve this? The very first thing we've got to do, and this is an issue around the country, is make sure that transit workers, particularly frontline transit workers, and to me, frontline transit workers obviously means bus drivers, light rail operators, train operators, but it also means the folks that work in maintenance, that are making sure that the vehicles can get out on the road. They're just as important too. We need to make sure they get vaccinated. And we're seeing some issues popping up. California, for example, there was a shift this week in the prioritization of people getting the vaccine, shifting toward age groups as opposed to characteristics like frontline workers. That's concerning because that puts public transit workers and other groups further back in line. And right now they need to be at the front of the line. Because they've been out on the front lines of this crisis for the past year, they've been some of the most heavily exposed and they've been some of the most heavily impacted. So we need to make sure they get vaccinated first. And then what do we do on top of that? Number one is provide free transit to vaccination sites. And that's something that we're beginning to see more public transit providers are starting to do this. Just a couple of examples. In San Antonio, Texas, via Metropolitan Transit, which is a large transit agency, it serves the whole San Antonio region. They're providing fare free connections to COVID-19 vaccination sites. And they've got a really good, simple policy on this. On the day of your vaccination, you bring an appointment confirmation. It can be a printout, it can be a confirmation on your phone, or you bring your vaccination shot record card. You show that to the bus driver and you board your bus to get your vaccination, and you show that on the way back. Nice and simple. It's easy from a policy perspective to train drivers, frontline workers, to know what to do when a customer has a vaccination record or an appointment confirmation. And it's a great message to send to customers that we're paying to get to the vaccine site should not be an obstacle in getting that vaccine. So that's VIA, that's in San Antonio. Also in Texas, Capital Metro in Austin, they are offering complimentary curb-to-curb service using their access vehicles, essentially their paratransit vehicles. One of the things that's great about this is they're not limiting this just to people who are existing, this is my understanding from them, to existing paratransit customers. Any customer who falls in the groups that are eligible to get the vaccine right now and has a confirmed appointment can make a complimentary reservation, take a Capital Metro vehicle and get their vaccine and get back home. That's fantastic. And then one other one to give you just an example out on the East Coast, Comet, which is the public transit agency in Columbia, South Carolina. My cat is obviously very excited about that one. Is offering, they've suspended fare collection on their buses. They've had fare collection suspended for much of the past year, and they are continuing that suspension in fare collection and offering free transit. And then on top of that, they are getting ready to roll out a campaign to promote taking public transit to get your vaccine. So those are just a few examples. There are other agencies that are beginning to do this, and I'll talk a little bit about where you can get a list of those a little later in the presentation. But again, that's number one, free transit access to vaccine sites. Number two is to host vaccination sites at transit hubs. Every agency has hubs in their system, and even the smallest agency typically has at least one major meeting point where, particularly bus routes come together. Agencies around the country have been offering testing at those sites. One of the early examples back in June of last year that really resonated with me is BART out in the Bay Area partnered up with the San Francisco Department of Health and UCSF to host COVID-19 testing at its 24th Street Mission station. So there are lots of other examples of agencies doing that, providing testing at stations. The natural next step for that, as vaccine supplies begin to grow in the coming weeks, is to look at transitioning those testing sites to vaccination sites. And that creates simplicity for transit customers. If you're on the system, you're traveling, you don't need to go out of your way to get the vaccine if a clinic is available right on your route, right where you catch your bus or train. So that's number two. And then number three is to deliver public health teams, vaccination teams directly to vulnerable communities. And the idea here is to take advantage of the deep knowledge that transit agencies have of local communities, connecting those communities. Think about the frontline workers there, the bus drivers, for example, who know their routes, know how to get people around communities very efficiently. If we need to get public health teams out to those vulnerable communities, to homebound folks who are not going to be able to easily get to a vaccination center, one of the best ways we can do that is deploying public health teams, and transit can help with that. So that's going to be another one to look at. So those are the three key ways that transit agencies and the public transit can get involved and help speed up vaccine equity. I conducted a survey on Twitter over the past week, because one of the big questions I wanted to ask is, folks out there, would you be willing to, if transit were available to get to your vaccine, would you be willing to take transit? And the good news is that the numbers were overwhelmingly in the positive column. Only 20% of respondents to the survey said no. 63.3% said yes, 16.7% said maybe. So that's 80% who are either definitely willing to or would consider it. And I think that's important for folks in the industry, at transit agencies, to know if you offer these services, customers are interested in it. They're willing to do it. And I think that 20% is an audience that potentially over time may come around as they see the service made available and they realize the convenience of it. So the numbers are on our side to do this, to provide this service to help. So where can you get more information? If you visit my website, I've got a page at stewartmader.com/vaxtransit. That's VAXTRANSIT. I'm building a list of agencies around the country that are offering free transit, free trips to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And I'm pleased to say that right now there's about 10 states now that have agencies, multiple agencies offering this. And I'm happy to add to this. I'm watching news updates. I'm talking to folks that I know at agencies throughout the industry, and I'll be updating this on a daily basis. If you know of an agency that's not on this list, please get in touch with me. You'll see at the bottom of this page, there's a form. You can just put in your name, put in quick information. If you just know of an agency and you want to drop in a link to it, to the URL, that's great. I will use that information. I'll get the page updated. And with that, I'd love to open it up to questions. Thanks, everyone.
Stewart, can you speak to the issue that's come up in the chat about people abandoning transit because they think it's high risk for getting COVID? What's your sense about that, and where are we as public transit advocates in validating that or countering that?
Great question, thank you. Yes, there's no doubt that the early sentiment around transit and the pandemic was one in which people were, as we know, transit ridership really dropped off a cliff in a way that I think none of us have probably seen in our lifetimes, particularly in early 2020. And that was for a very good reason. Many transit agencies actively encouraged customers to stay home, to follow stay-at-home orders, shelter in place, lockdowns as they were called. And that's what caused the initial steep drop-off in ridership. In fact, and that's where I think we've got to be careful and make sure people know that, because that initial drop-off to stay home for safety reasons, combined with lots of uncertainty about how the COVID-19 virus is transmitted, how people get infected, I think has led people to maintain some reticence about transit, to stay away. Now, lots of transit agencies early on were very focused in their messaging about cleaning systems, surface cleaning, disinfecting, using aerosols, using UV lights, testing lots of ways to make sure vehicles are clean. As the scientific research has grown over the past year, one of the things that's really emerged is that the concern is less about surfaces and more about people being in prolonged contact with each other for long periods of time. And that's a positive for transit, because a lot of transit trips are relatively short. People jump on and off of subways and buses. They're not in significant contact. In other words, an office where you might spend 7 or 8 hours in contact with people is a far more concerning place than a bus or train where you might be on for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. Additionally, we're seeing research from, and this is particularly research that we've seen come in from East Asia and from some European transit systems. There's value in being quiet when you're riding, not talking, keeping your mask on, and also keeping quiet. So not using the phone and not talking with each other. And as anybody who's traveled on a major transit system or knows the culture of major transit systems like the New York City subway, long before the pandemic, it was considered a hallmark of being a seasoned New York City subway rider to get on and never talk. So for some of us, that's an easy practice to maintain. But it's also good news. I think understanding that you can get on a train or bus and you can be safe in traveling is an important message. It's an important message that transit providers need to increasingly make sure that they're making it part of their messaging to customers. They need to reinforce that message as much as they reinforced the message early on that they were cleaning their buses and trains and maintaining a clean environment. Because I think an important way out of this world we're living in, or this moment we're in, where transit ridership has dropped to historically low levels, is to associate public transit and public health. Transit is a major contributor to public health in ways that are very much separate from the pandemic moment we're in. Think about how transit correlates to walkability, to long-term positive health outcomes. And when you think about that, it adds to the importance of making sure that we bring transit ridership back up to levels that really sustain transit over the long term. And that's why that to me is one of the drivers in why I thought about the association between transit and vaccination and this 3-step plan for agencies to support it, because agencies that do this are going to have they're going to have a lasting message where transit is associated with the positive outcome from the pandemic, which is getting vaccinated and being able to get out of the necessary social isolation that we've all are living through in order to stay safe and to keep each other safe.
Hey, Stewart, have you reached out to larger agencies? I'm here in the Midwest, and so particularly, Kansas City area, they have gone fare free for a while, and that's been a huge discussion. But on top of that, looking at, I work for the DOT, and a lot of our areas, especially rural, have the transportation has kind of ramped up as people have need to get to doctor's appointments at various sites. I guess I'm trying to figure out, I saw the question on here that someone posted about turning a transit site or a transit bus actually into a vaccination hub, which I was kind of thinking the same thing. Have you seen a lot of really rural areas start to use transit or transportation? I mean, I'm looking at maybe going to a couple of these outlining our city boards and their committees and kind of pitching this to them, making the case that, hey, this is a good idea because a lot of the rural areas need transportation still, or they've had to cut back. And so they have to follow not only our guidelines, FTA guidelines, social services guidelines, depends on where the funding's coming from. So, just there's a lot of things they have to juggle with. But have you seen a lot of rural areas kind of using the transportation, using, the kind of like ride to vaccination campaign or?
I'm starting to see that, yes. So one example to look at is the state of North Carolina. The North Carolina Department of Transportation and Department of Public Health are distributing $2.5 million in funding, in COVID-19 relief funding, to 99 transit agencies around the state, specifically to enable vaccine access. And the agencies have flexibility in how they use it. Some of the agencies are looking at just what you mentioned, which is using buses for rural areas. To get the vaccine out, to get public health teams out into rural areas and vaccinate folks there. And they're also looking at providing, and then they're also using it to fund providing free trips to vaccines. The first city that I've seen in North Carolina to announce their plans around that is Wilmington. Wave Transit is offering free transit to, there's a large vaccine site in Wilmington, and they're offering free trips on their service. So to answer your question, I think we're going to see a lot more of this begin to ramp up in the coming weeks. And I think, to your point, using buses to get teams out is especially helpful for rural areas where people are not going to come together necessarily to a hub, and that's why that's one of the 3 points in my plan is to use the buses. It's also a great way to keep drivers, operators on the job. One of the big concerns, obviously, is agencies are facing budget crunches, and the last thing they want to do is lay people off. Having transit providers, having transit drivers, particularly bus drivers, helping get teams out to vaccinate keeps them on the job. And that's going to be important for recovery, because once we get people vaccinated, the last thing we want to do is face a situation where an agency has been forced, through no fault of its own, essentially through the loss of revenue, to have to lay people off and then have to go back and try to bring them back in and rebuild service. So getting the vaccine out is a great way to keep people working in the meantime. Thanks for that question, by the way.
Following up on that question, Stewart, you mentioned bus drivers knowing their communities and really knowing how to navigate into people in need. Is Paratransit also another way of, agencies, a lot of them have Paratransit, they run shuttle bus routes. Is that another option? I'm sort of thinking of Meals on Wheels. That's sort of a model.
It is. So the example of Capital Metro in Austin, they're using their paratransit vehicles specifically for this purpose. They're essentially letting, as I say, they're letting people beyond their usual paratransit customer base make reservations to take the vehicles. And part of the reason in their explanation for it is that's how they're ensuring that people are able to maintain physical distance while they're traveling to get their shots. There's another agency in, I want to say Belleville, Illinois. It's in the St. Louis metro area that's also using their paratransit vehicles. That's one that's on the list on my website. They're also using their paratransit vehicles to enable people to get access to the vaccine. And Anjoli just confirmed to me that I'm right. Yes, Belleville is in the St. Louis metro, the bi-state metro. That's right.
Stuart, I'm not sure
Excellent.
if you have the answer to this, but do you have an explanation as to why there's a lot of vaccine sites that are in non-transit friendly environments?
Hey, David, that's a great question. I could probably explain that by going all the way back to too much car-oriented, auto-oriented planning. But I think the sort of the answer to that in the more acute sense in the moment is some of the sites where mass vaccination, some of the locations where mass vaccination sites, say that 3 times fast, have been set up are folks are kind of doing what makes sense in the moment, which is going to large scale sites. And that means sports stadiums, convention centers, places where you can get a lot of people in and out, and they're building it around the model of people driving through, because that was sort of the early acute intervention that was used for testing starting last spring when testing ramped up. Folks looked at sports stadiums and people driving in their cars. And a lot of that, I think, was oriented around the idea that that felt safe to people because they're in their own car, they're separate from others. So I think the thinking's been built around that. And that's why, to me, it's really important that we make sure we don't let ourselves be too beholden to that thinking, because what we end up with is sites that are limited by the mode, but really what they're limiting is they're limiting equity. And that's not to say that a mass vaccination site that's out there today, that's got, largely people are arriving by car, can't adapt. One of the things that could be done, my cat is endorsing this idea, is that we could take buses, for instance, that run near those sites and make sure that they're able to bring people to the site, or take, if agencies are running lower service than usual right now, take buses in the fleet that are idle and run a shuttle service from a transit hub to a large sports stadium and let people get in and out that way. And part of the message to people with that is, a lot of this is, if you're already riding transit because you're an essential worker and you need to get out and get to work, or get to, medical, doctor appointment, pick up your prescription, your groceries, what have you, we need to add vaccination to that list and make sure that people who are doing those other things because they use transit in that multi-purpose way have just as easy access to the vaccine. The last thing I want to see is somebody who uses the bus all the time as part of their daily life has to go out of their way and try to find a way to get to a vaccination site by car.
Thanks for that answer.
Sure.
Stuart, wouldn't they be able to possibly use the COVID funding from FTA to set up transit vaccination sites? I mean, that I think would fall under some of those requirements, or either kind of providing free or vouchers to transport.
That's
I know
my understanding.
5310 does not get the funding because that was quite a big discussion issue, but 5311, those two.
Right, you're exactly right. Yeah, that 5311 seems a little less clear to me, but that's also where I think with the coming, or at least hopefully the coming round of funding from the Biden administration, the American Rescue Plan, they have a batch of funding. I think it's about $20 billion in that plan that is specifically focused on setting up and expanding community vaccination sites. And those community vaccination sites, based on, I haven't seen draft language of a bill, but what I've seen in the way they've described it, it sounds to me like public transit hubs would be eligible for that, and could work with departments of health to set those up. Or I should say, would be eligible to serve as the sites for those clinics, with the funding going to departments of health to actually run the clinics. I think that the moral of the story here, or the takeaway for all of this, is there's a huge opportunity to make sure that transit is playing a role for the communities that are multi-purpose riders who use transit every day to make sure they can get to the vaccine, and there are funding streams out there that can make this happen. I think, for example, North Carolina shows a promising example of how a state is looking at this on a statewide level and answering the question on funding for agencies. But it's going to be a critical question in the coming weeks as we see how the next round of funding shapes up. And I'm seeing, I think Anjali just put in the chat, also Uber and Lyft are on this as well. Uber and Lyft have rolled out programs to enable vaccination. Basically, you can call an Uber or Lyft to take you for vaccination. The one concern that I would raise with that's been on my mind are the drivers, the Uber and Lyft drivers, able to get their vaccinations? Because the last thing I want to see is a situation where somebody calls an Uber or Lyft to get to a vaccination site and the driver is not vaccinated. We want to make sure they're protected too. So think of them in the same way you'd think of a bus driver.
That was David and Carla's comment. Maybe they have more on that because I was kind of wondering the same thing. I think that's a cool idea, but making sure they're safe.
Yes.
I don't know if they have any more on that or.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of this research. So most of our research has been going to these areas, particularly like Los Angeles, that you brought up in your example, in San Diego. We've been spending a lot of time in those areas. The challenge is actually what was brought up at UCLA Transit Symposium was that car-free movement has actually caused more COVID distress in BIPOC communities. And looking at one thing that I think we put in the chat was most transit systems in suburban areas like this and in San Diego are hub and spoke, and the issue is getting to that spoke. So in Los Angeles, you could have a free ride from Union Station to Dodger Stadium, but the challenge would be to be able to arrive at Union Station. So in that, you could spend an hour not getting to Union Station. Plus, the issue is now dealing with these transit systems that aren't free, and then they've cut back service. So, one thing is service is not perfect in BIPOC and low-income communities to begin with. During COVID, most of those lines were cut off, and so there was not an access to the spoke, which then there was more rhetoric and slow streets and car free and parking things that were taken away, making it hard for senior citizens, those with disabilities, and those who are in areas. So we really have to start to look at this narrative that we've been kind of going on for the last probably about more than 15 years on, what we've been characterizing as green crow. The idea of taking away the car, which used to be in Los Angeles or places like it, where you have a bucket, right? And that's your A to B car that would get you where the transit wasn't, or to a spoke. In Los Angeles, that would be like a Union Station, right? Or something that would be along that line that had a park and ride. The challenge right now is places, we're doing a mapping overlay of a visualization of where parking and car-free strategies are and where COVID hotspots are. So we're seeing a direct translation in these issues where we've gotten things to be car-free and transit, we're in transit first type strategies. And so being that, like, I live in San Francisco and I've seen a lot of people use the slides in San Francisco. If you look at communities like the Bayview, Hunters Point, and Mission districts where they're hot spots, you also see slow streets and these kind of things that were enacted. And so we have to balance all of this out as to say that free transit has been a winner. When we saw transit agencies move to free transit, we did see ridership pick up. Choice rider things in budgets need to be reviewed. So that's mobile apps, that's fair transit systems, biking infrastructure over safety and access. And so these are some of the things, like in your presentation, that we have to understand, like what is going on. The COVID reset is real. We now understand than ever where these things are.
Sorry. So now,
Great points, and I know we're right up on time. The last thing I'll just mention on that, to your point about hub and spoke, is take LA for example. There are multiple bus lines that run, like the 28 that run right by Dodger Stadium, and to my mind, it's making sure that those buses, those local lines, are able to serve people who want to get to the vaccine is a big part of it. Because you're right, we don't want people to have to go to a hub just to catch a shuttle. A lot of this is about making sure the networks are activated in the right way. So listen, thanks everybody. I really appreciate all the input. The questions were great, and I want to make sure that we all jump over. And I believe